The US economy shrank again in the last 3 months, unofficially signaling the start of a recession. The Commerce Department announced Thursday that gross domestic product (GDP), a broad measure of the price of goods and services, decreased at an annualized rate of 0.9% in the second quarter after falling at an annualized rate of 1.6% in the first 3 months. This is significantly lower than the 6.9% annual increase recorded at the end of 2021 when the economy was recovering from the COVID-19 shutdown. The fast growth contributed to soaring inflation and determined the Federal Reserve to tighten monetary policies and increase interest rates to bring down inflation. Hi, my name is Gio. Hope you're doing well. In today's episode, let's take a look at the reported GDP growth and see if we really are in a recession or not. Let's get right into it. The changing economic environment was reflected in the GDP report. Consumer spending, which is the largest driver of the economy, slowed over the last quarter but remained positive, rising 1% on an annual basis. Residential fixed investment or home construction dropped 14% on an annual basis and slowing business inventories. Goods produced but not sold yet by businesses dragged down the GDP number. 2 quarters of reported negative GDP growth are signaling that the economy has gone into a recession. But the National Bureau of Economic Research is the official arbiter of when recession begins and when it ends. While the GDP figures will play into the National Bureau of Economic Research final verdict, it also looked at many economic factors including the job market and is unlikely to give its decision soon. The decline in GDP came from many factors, including decrease in inventories, residential and non-residential investment, and government spending at the federal, state, and local level. Gross private domestic investment fell 13.5% for the 3-month period. Consumer spending, as measured through personal consumption expenditure, increased only 1% for the period, regardless of the accelerated inflation. Spending on services increased during the period by 4.1%, but it was balanced by decline in non-durable goods of 5.5% and durable goods of 2.6%. Inventories, which helped increase GDP in 2021, pulled back growth in the second quarter, subtracting 2 percentage points from the total. Inflation was the main problem for the economy. The consumer price index increased 9.1% in a quarter, the fastest pace since Q4 of 1981. That resulted in a decline of inflation adjusted after-tax personal income of 0.5%, while the personal saving rate was 5.2%, down from 5.6% in the first quarter. The latest GDP report came a day after the Federal Reserve announced another 3/4 of a percentage point increase of interest rates in response to fighting inflation. While part of the US economy remains strong, most notably the job market, the COVID-19 pandemic continued to play with global supplies and the war in Ukraine has pushed up the energy prices. The confusing economic outlook has triggered sell-offs in stock markets around the world and made some economists predict a recession in near future. However, both President Joe Biden and Federal Reserve Chair said we are not yet in a recession, pointing to the strong labor market and rising wages. President Joe Biden placed record job growth and foreign business investment as sign of strengthening in the economy and said that doesn't sound like a recession. The 2-quarter definition is helpful for analysts, journalists, and the general public, but it is not how economists think about business cycles, especially because GDP is a wide measure that can be influenced by many factors like government spending or international trade. Instead, economists focus on data on jobs, industrial production, spending, and incomes, and job growth in particularly remains strong in the United States, with the US employers hiring more than expected in June and rising wages. So, is a recession always the 2 consecutive quarters of falling GDP? Usually, but not always. For example, GDP in 2001 after revision fell in the first 3 months of the year, rebounded in the next 3 months, and declined again in the fall. Even though there were not 2 consecutive quarters of declining GDP, the situation was defined as a recession because employment and industrial production were falling drastically. Who decides and how if we are in a recession? In the United States, the official call is made by a panel of economists ordered by the National Bureau of Economic Research and sometimes come a year or more after the fact. The private non-profit research group defined recession as a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and that lasts more than a few months. The panel concentrates on things like jobs and industrial output that are measured monthly, not quarterly, like GDP. It studied the detail of any changes, how long decline seems to be lasting, and how rapidly any trouble is spread across the economy. For example, during the pandemic, the drop of job loss in excess of 20 million positions offset the fact that growth resumed quickly, leading to groups to officially call the situation a recession in early June before the end of the second quarter. While depth, diffusion, and even duration needs to be met individually to some degree, extreme conditions revealed by one of these may particularly offset weaker indication from another. So, are we really on a recession or not? It's hard to say, but here is why we may be and why we may not be. While the two-quarter rule has been met, there has never been a recession declared without a loss of employment. Jobs are being added in the US by hundreds of thousands monthly. The US labor market is very strong right now by many measures. In June, the United States has recovered 98% of job loss during the pandemic, and all private sector job loss at the start of the pandemic have been recovered. Unemployment has remained at its historical low in 2022. The recovery following the COVID-19 recession has been much faster than previous recoveries, and it has been much more fair for groups that are usually left behind in recoveries. Since January 2022, the United States has added 2.2 million jobs, recording the fastest job growth in June. Yet, during each of these past few recessions, massive job losses occurred. Today's strong job growth is simply inconsistent with all the recent recession. Initial unemployment insurance claims remain low, much lower than tends to occur before a recession takes place. Layoffs are also a historical low and job openings are at a record high. In May, there were about 2 open positions for every job seeker. The economy is creating almost 400,000 jobs a month, and paychecks in June were also growing. All these signs indicate a strong labor market where businesses expect continued economic growth and not a recession. Industrial production and real spending, which are other factors the committee considered to determine a recession, have remained strong this year. The phase will likely slow, but there will need to be a drastic reversal for the current rate of job growth to turn into one that looks like a recession. Since the 1950s, United States has not experienced a 2-quarter in a row contraction in GDP that was not ultimately associated with a recession, which could make the current debate about recession even harder. If we look at the consumer sentiment and spending, Americans are spending more than they were a month ago. Consumer spending, the largest part of the US economy, is rising. That's a good sign for the economy. Household spending grew in June by 1.1%, up from a 0.3% increase in May, the Commerce Department reported on Friday. That growth, however, could be a result of rising inflation. Overall, Americans are growing pessimistic about the economy. If we look at the yield curve, the shape of the yield curve, which shows the return of Treasury securities, is one of the most reliable indicators of the health of the economy, and it has been a flashing sign of a recession for most of July. An inverted yield curve is often seen as a signal that investors are more nervous about the immediate future than the long term, leading interest rates on short-term bonds to move higher than those paid on long-term bonds. Fed Chair Jeremy Powell on Wednesday said that he does not think the economy is currently in a recession, but yield curves say something else. They moved into an inversion in the past few weeks. A yield curve inversion has predicted every single recession since 1955, according to research from the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. And the conclusion to all this information, there is no doubt that the global economy is undergoing a period of uncertainty with Russia's war on Ukraine, climate-related disruption, and an ongoing health pandemic. The biggest risk to the US economy remain global economic problems and over-aggressive action by the Federal Reserve. However, the current state of the US economy, especially the labor market, is still relatively strong and is different from all recent recessions. If the Federal Reserve increased interest rates too rapidly to lower inflation by slowing economic activity, it may cause a recession and put all the progress at risk. While the Federal Reserve is roughly responsible to high inflation, it doesn't have to overreact and rapidly increase interest rates. Furthermore, inflation is largely a supply-side aspect which monetary policy cannot directly affect. If anything, higher interest rates may cause a slowdown in supply in a certain sector, such as housing, that are already suffering shortages. A recession is not inevitable, and it is important that policymakers, including the Federal Reserve, do all they can to ensure one does not take place to prevent putting millions of people out of work. Just a reminder, nothing from this channel should be considered an investment and financial advice because the information is presented without consideration of the investment objective, risk tolerance, or financial circumstances of any specific investor and might not be suitable for all investors. Investors should consider engaging a qualified financial and tax professional to determine a suitable investment strategy. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you find this content helpful, smash that like and subscribe button to help this channel grow, turn on the notification bell, and check out all the links in the description down below. See you in the next video. Stay safe.